Just saw Barry Lyndon, 35 millimeter. And the print looks like it came from 75 or 76. Well, I mean, it's December 75. It looked terrible, man. I'm going to be honest. It looked like it had been dragged through the mud. I knew Leon Vitali a little bit. I met him a couple times. Once at the Kubrick exhibit at LACMA. And I think he'd have been horrified at the quality of the prints. Jesus. You know, I was assuming they had cleaned it up a little bit. You know, that they would find something from the Kubrick estate to show, but I guess it was probably just an old print from maybe the manager said maybe the original Angelika. But God almighty, you would think, and you know, it does affect how you perceive the film. It was discussed on, one of my favorite films of the millennium, Never Let Me Go. I did a video essay on that. How you see a film. Vital. Vital. I mean, it is, a film screening. This was a 35 millimeter print of Barry Lyndon at the Angelika, and I was really looking forward to it. The expectation was a bit off the charts, probably a tad unrealistic. Careful what you wish for. It was certainly a 35 millimeter print. Never Let Me Go. That was kind of it was a awards season screening in 2010 for that film. Not much expectation. Didn't really read any reviews. Knew that it got, good word of mouth at TIFF, Toronto International Film Festival. I've seen Barry Lyndon countless times on video only. Never saw a physical print of it. And so, one of the things, as you can see in the backdrop here, what really glows, transferring color negative to digitally, to, in this case, DVD or Blu-ray, or, even back in the day on VHS, you'd have this beautiful glow, which you couldn't really see this in the print, coupled with the fact that the print was just awful. They would release it in a few hundred theaters, but it was not like 1,500 theaters, 1,200 theaters, there's massive releases like in the 90s and so forth. But a few hundred theaters, so, there were several hundred prints. Really bad shape. The first few reels were very rough. But it's still a masterpiece. That being said, it's still a brilliant film in every level. First scene, as I just pointed out, you saw Ryan O'Neal there. This is the first scene where you really see the candlelight sequences that, as I say, really pop and they really glow when you see them on video. Not as much on the print. Lord Bullington is played by Leon Vitali. Leon Vitali goes on to be Kubrick's personal assistant. I met Leon a couple of times. Once at the Kubrick exhibit in LACMA in the actual Napoleon Barry Lyndon room, which struck me as curious thinking about it, as I was preparing to do this, that he probably was hanging out there hoping someone would know who he was, because he kind of just looked like an old hippie with a ponytail. If you didn't know what he looked like, if I hadn't met him prior, I wouldn't have put two and two together, but I was able to talk to him for a while, and he was a really sweet guy. And I'll just tell you that if he were alive, if Stanley were alive, I'm kind of going to maybe put this on, Twitter and at, Kubrick's estate or whatever. But I mean, if those guys were alive, I'm pretty much convinced we would not have seen a print in that kind of shape. I think they would have insisted on something much better from their estate. Dallas is the fourth largest media market in North America. I mean, I don't care if it was a screening in Peoria. Stanley Kubrick and Leon Vitali, you have to see the documentary Film Worker. That's, I have the DVD actually signed by Matthew Modine. He spent all his time curating Stanley's prints, making sure that they looked as sharp as could possibly be. That was pretty much all Leon did. And so there's so many directions to take it, but one is that, film discourse today, It's just at an all. I mean, it is. I've met so many filmmakers on the festival circuit that literally know next to nothing about film. Usually from another discipline, could be, whatever, science or business or whatever, and want to do a career change. And just, I've talked to various filmmakers, barely seen, Paul Schrader films or Michael Mann or, oh, there's so much to watch. It's like, nobody had to tell Michael Jordan to practice basketball, dude. This is supposed to be a passion. It was embarrassing, but what was really cool at that screening is it was near SMU, and they have a really strong film media program, and theater as well. And you could tell there were some SMU students there, and that was very, very heartening. I wanted to tell them a little bit about, meeting Leon, and I don't know how deep into the Kubrick thing they were, but, just the fact that if those guys were around, we would have seen a much better print than we did. A couple things should be said also about the organic experience of going to screen. There was a very long intermission, right? Too long. It was 20 minutes. I think with a film like this in particular, it's barely 3 hours. I don't think you even really needed the intermission, but you should have it. Absolutely. It's designed that way. But it did hurt the momentum of the film. The second part really gets a lot more intense. And it leads into something that I think is really intriguing. Throughout, leading up to it, it's very clear. It really sticks out now that Redmond Barry is really just a garden variety alcoholic. Everything he's doing, it's at one point his mom says, oh, Lady Lyndon may tire of your wild Irish ways. Anybody who's been around booze is of Irish descent as I am, as well as Italian and French, it's just code for a drunk. He's just a fucking drunk. And I'm going to get into more detail on this because it's ironic. Stanley makes a couple films in a row. This is not as explicit. He has other things on his mind, but The Shining, his next film, is essentially about a dry drunk who goes literally insane because he cannot get a drink, okay? And that's going to lead into a more extensive essay. I'm going to talk about Bob Fosse and all that jazz, and a little bit of Fosse Verdon, and how he basically drinks and drugs himself to death and records it in the film, by the way. He's just a speed freak and an alcoholic. And it's kind of the way that Hollywood does treat alcoholism and drug addiction. Like it's this treatment BS that there's all this underlying stuff when the fact is they're just drunk. They like the effect. I can't go into too much detail about certain aspects of it, but I do want to cover it as it pertains to some really brilliant films. I'm not going to go the direction of Clean and Sober and these mediocre films. I mean, Days of Wine and Roses was really actually well done, but I'm talking more about art that just so happens to have, the drug and alcohol addiction in its subtext at sometimes, right? And here with Barry Lyndon, he's just a garden variety drunk. Every step of the way, he's making terrible decisions based on the fact that he's a drunk. In this particular scene, his son has died of an accident, and that gives him, he was already fucking drinking like crazy and passed out half the time and doing a bunch of crazy stuff, pissing off Lady Lyndon and all these things. And the reason the mom has to convince him to get a title is because of his quote-unquote wild Irish ways, because he's a drunk, his wild Irish ways. He's just an alcoholic, period. And, this is, he's, in his cups and wasted, and this is where Lord Bullington has to get rid of him and challenge him to a duel. Go into more detail about The Shining, and then as well as, Bob Fosse's All That Jazz, and go into a little bit of the series Fosse Verdon that goes into some of the behind the scenes. His daughter, Nicole, was a big source for that mini-series by FX, who was very open about her, her own addiction. And, it's very instructive, really. It's ironic that I connect those, Kubrick and Fosse, because Kubrick professed to be a huge fan of All That Jazz, and of course, Probably didn't hurt that Fosse name checks him. I wonder if Stanley Kubrick is how he pronounces it, went through these problems. But it's intriguing that it really popped for me this time around that Barry Lyndon, Redmond Barry, the Ryan O'Neal character is just a drunk. He's an alcoholic in his cups. The alcoholism, if you will, is not front and center the way it is in The Shining, right? With the amount of time that Kubrick and Diane Johnson, who co-wrote the script, spend on The Shining is a completely different issue, as well as the source material with Stephen King. But it's certainly there. The themes that are most prevalent in Barry Lyndon are Kubrick's themes of a certain kind of fatalism. He's almost doomed to make these certain mistakes because of the nature of his character. In Man, to a certain extent, even, with Lord Bullingdon, you could say, the breaking point is, when he embarrasses him at this party for Brian and puts Brian in issues, his biological son, and then he humiliates everybody and goes after his mom and so on and so forth, and then his mother leaves, and then that's when Redmond Barry Lyndon attacks him, and then there's a big brawl and makes a spectacle of himself, and he was terribly cruel to his stepson who humiliated him. But the fact of the matter is, regardless of or irrespective of that, as he's trying to break into proper society and get a title, he may not, that might not have been a deal breaker had he handled it properly, had he maybe, in a classy way chastised, Lord Bullingdon and not made a spectacle of himself and, appealed to, the guy who's trying to get him the title. But the fact of the matter is he lost his shit, and of course he made it so that, there was no way that he was going to be able to achieve what he was looking for because of his character flaw, his innate character flaw, which is definitely a Kubrickian theme. Man kind of with these inherent flaws is kind of destined for this certain fate, if you will, which is in a lot of his films.